The little pointer button there.
Good. All right. Thank you, John. Well, my name is Frank Lake, and I work for U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Southwest Research Station. And a lot of my graduate work, I finished my PhD here at Oregon State University, revolved around trying to articulate and understand just how, when, why, and where, and the specificity of the various tribes in the Pacific West, in particular Northwest California and Western Oregon, used fire. And so it's going to be a bit of a kind of a traditional ecological knowledge view, but encapsulated more in the standard Western approach of a PowerPoint with slides and probably heavy on the text, but we'll work through that. And thank you for the invitation to be here. And I also want to recognize the Kalapuya's traditional territory, and I appreciate Esther being here and others sharing what they have. So thank you to the Oregon tribes. So if we have traditional ecological knowledge, we have to employ that knowledge of some way, and I've come up with this term, cultural environmental management practices. And essentially these are how you utilize the knowledge that you have on the landscape. And one of those, most important to the tribes, is being fire use. When we think about fire, John touched on this a little bit, but it's important to think about scale, particularly what is a culturally significant resource or area of the landscape that the tribes would have a desire to burn if, in the absence of lightning, that area wasn't burned to the desired qualities that the tribes would want. Why would they burn there? And so we have to think about that from the standpoint of maybe looking at the organism level, of this being the basketry important, maybe a bush or a shrub that's important for basketry, how that fits into a population, how that fits into part of the community, and then as we're looking at and talking across various areas, how that fits into this nexus and this matrix of a landscape. And within this, each of these might have a different application of fire by the tribes that kind of moves both up and down in scale as to the cultural importance and the post-fire condition of that site. This concept of indigenous or cultural fire regimes, perhaps different from what we maybe would characterize as natural fire regimes, and these are some definitions that I'm using to build upon Hank Lewis's work, who studied indigenous cultures all over the world. Basically, manipulation of fuel types by manual removal or placement and intentional burning, so the gathering of fuels and used around camps and villages, and ignition patterns to promote desired fire behavior and associated intensities for predictable effects to produce ecological goods, and also those are integrated in with nature services. The importance of this fire regime from a tribal use of fire are the frequencies at which fires are set and reset over various periods of time. And importantly also too, were alternate seasons of burning. When we look at like the lightning ignition potential here in the West, it has to do with the drying or the curing of fuels, the receptivity of those fuels, but also as John talked about, the climatic events or the fire weather that's going on. But as we look at and use different lines of evidence, we're finding that tribal people not only burn during the summer, but they also burn on the tail ends of the fire season, whether it was earlier in the spring or later in the fall, or in some cases even in that late winter, early spring when you have those cold, clear, dry days, often fern burning or burning of lighter fuels. And that leads to the specificity of sites that are fired and those that aren't, given what you want from that in the post condition. Corresponding intensities, which fuels can be burned, is an important one. That intensity often leads to the severity. And then utilizing or keying into both topographically and even geologically, because often it's the soil types and the vegetation there or the topography that helps set up some natural as well as artificial or human fuel breaks. And that ties a lot into both limiting the spread of the fire, the time of day in which you burn, looking and keying into the winds, the fuel types, the slope, the relative humidity. We think about maybe not so much in like scientific terms, relative humidity, but from traditional knowledge might be more like, well, how crisp, how do the branches break, how light and dry does the grass feel, does the fuel type feel like, and thinking about this in my oral history interviews of tribal elders and looking at ethnographic information, particularly the time of day. Some of this was ritualized, or there was ignition strategies tied into ceremonies that either village headmen or the ladies who were the basket weavers, depending upon the tribal group, there was the igniters. And sometimes that was kind of a village headman position, or sometimes it was a family unit that would go burn specific areas of the landscape behind their villages. The winds, often we talk about fire weather. There's these prefrontal or postfrontal winds that really change the direction. Like John showed, at first you had a foehn wind or one coming from the east, which was really warm, dry east winds. Well, then you can also get a marine inversion or an intrusion from the coast that will dampen things down. Some of the research I've done and also talking to elders say that those winds were key. Feeling the humidity when you're out there. How does it feel, smell? What is the condition like? What are the animals doing? There was a lot of other environmental cues and indicators that went into particularly why tribal people would burn. And then the fuel loads. Perhaps an area that was formerly burned, you know, is going to be a natural fuel break, but it also runs against and adjacent to a trail. So you know that you could light off here, perhaps at the bottom of this section of this hill, that would give you a higher, more intense fire with a rapid rate of spread, or you can back it down from the ridge and let it creep down the hillside. So that ties into the slope and the other fuel breaks. So when we think about this, it all kind of fits together where we have the seasonality, the frequency, and the ignition, and this really ultimately comes back to fire-induced ecological goods and services. And for tribal communities, both historically as well as today, it gets back to the food, the water, and the materials that sustains them and sustains their cultural well-being and their economies. So in a generalized sense, what are Indian burning practices? Those enduring practices, those are practices of fire by Indians and pre- and post-European settlement that resulted in changed or stabilized landscape scale vegetation patterns. And this essentially is firewood, patch, and broadcast. And with those, there's a series of objectives that can go along with this application of fire. Those three levels of fire use fit into kind of the short list of documented reasons, and I'll just go through a few of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there was various reasons and why and how tribal people burned. Hunting was an important one, particularly crop management, but also defined on what type of crop, whether it was berries in shrub fields, or it was going to be roots in prairies, and range management. Also fireproofing that goes along with the firewood collection and the fuel wood. And then clearing areas for travel, because if you were going to leave the village or you had campsites higher up in the mountains or different places, you need to be able to get there effectively. And one perhaps less well known was even the clearing or burning of riparian areas. And we think of here in the Willamette Valley, you burn out of the oaks down into the canvas swales and then into the ash and the willow thickets. That's that fringe of both flooding disturbance or hydro disturbance working with a bit of pyro disturbance to give you ecotonal edge of higher diversity that also produces those goods and services. And then with that, it ties right into the basket material or things that you need. And for the Western tribes, they didn't necessarily have a large pottery tradition. There was a little bit. Mostly it was basketry. So firewood, it was often ladies as well as men, both on age and gender, collecting firewood for heating, for lighting, for food preservation, as well as any other refuse you had from all the other plant materials and wood products that you used would be utilized and burned. Range management, this was often kind of like either at the patch or broadcast type of burning. If you look at this small prairie here, it could be anywhere from maybe 5 to 20 acre size area. Fire was used and burned there, perhaps in the fall time, but also might have been spring to help increase the forage and attract animals there. That then facilitated easier hunting. And so there's often multiple purposes for that. For the crops, here in the Willamette Valley, we often hear about tarweed or greens. If you burn in the fall and you get that spring green up, there was a lot of different forbs that were important for greens and for vitamins coming after a long winter diet of dried and dried foods and stored foods. That's important to have those spring greens. And then we see also keying into a lot of use for seeds. And this is an example of a Poma woman using a seed beater and collecting seeds there. And often, thinking about it from the crop level, to improve the yield, both root crops in the ground through nutrient cycling, through reducing competition, that also reduces competition for water, so you have higher soil moisture. And then for berries, you see a year or two after an increase in berry production. And then one part on this, with the crop management, if you're burning as much as the fuels can basically be recruited in that area due to the productivity, you use horticultural practices like pruning or weeding in between to kind of maximize the production of berry production or nut production throughout that time until the next burn. And then for the basketry, if you look here with this woman, here's the baby basket here, and these are all the different sticks. I mean, this big pack basket right there perhaps was 500 to 600 straight, evenly sized hazel sticks, or perhaps you had willow or other places that might be redbud. If you go out there and you look across a burnt area and you look at a little clump of hazel resprouting back, you get a range of different sticks, you know. And so if you think this clump, and this is part of my research I'm doing with the basket weavers now, was this clump had maybe perhaps 3 out of 20 stems that were usable for basketry pre-burning, and then after the fire comes through, it might have 23 out of 25 sticks that are usable. And so you're thinking, wow, this burning and coming back, whether it was a fall burn, it's usually 17 or 18 months later in that next spring that it was gathered, or if it's a spring burn to the following spring burn, smaller sticks, different type of basket. You know, there was keying into a lot of seasonality and specificity of which shrubs, based on their life history, you could utilize. And so when you just think about this much material for 1 year for this woman, that's acres of material that she would have to go to. Or if you had the predictability of the post-fire environment, then you could utilize your effectiveness in harvesting as much material as you could, but still leaving some there for regeneration, for photosynthesis of those plants. And then ultimately, if you're leaving the village and you're going out the burning area, how do you get there? What's important? And trails, whether traversable ridges or the trail system, was extremely important to all native cultures in most early pre-industrial societies. And Indians used fire to clear overgrown trails to ease their traveling. And these often were these same trail systems were the ignition locations, and also served as a fuel break. And so if you were going along a sub-ridge up to this main ridge system and you look back down there at the village and you're headed up to a spring and a high mountain camp, this sub-ridge you're on breaks up this little sub-drainage from this drainage. And then when you get up to that ridge, perhaps you have a whole different aspect change, and you'll find on that northern aspect, you'll find older growth forest, a longer fire return interval, the south-facing aspect, upper third slope position. It's easier to burn, it's more receptive to ignition at different times of the year, and so you're burning different compartments, or like we would say now, fire management units at different times, but trails help get you there. And so this is some of the work that Dr. Bob Zyback and I are working on for Oregon Coast, and basically this shows that you have, your biophysical conditions. Here's the Pacific Ocean, here's the Willamette Valley, you have your west to east gradient as well as topographic gradient as you go over the coast range. But that there was tribal communities on both sides, and they traded, and they went and shared perhaps different resource areas from south to north as well as west to east, utilizing trails. And another example of this is if we look down on perhaps even closer in scale, we get at what we're talking about here, where we have the villages down below and we have camps higher up on these peaks. And I think a lot of times when we think about just the biophysical conditions that set up why fire would spread and the amount of fuel loads there was also another layer of kind of complexity to it in the mosaics that were created by tribal burning. And so even though we have riparian areas that perhaps had old growth cedar and hemlock, we might have other areas that were more grassland swales merging into oak woodlands. And so you have to begin to break up the landscape and think about why would people be managing fire in these environments, and what are the key resources there that were culturally important. And again, it often gets back to that trade network. So if we understand a bit historically why tribes utilize fire, how that sets up the template for what kind of goods and services that would be available there, whether it's the food, the medicine, or the materials, then we think about, well, how and why do tribes voice the importance of using fire today? And we think about it in the context of restoration. If we just go back and look at some of the historical maps, and then we look at the stand surveys, we'd say, okay, this is old growth ponderosa pine here. We have an understory of perhaps other shrubs like ceanothus or huckleberries. We can reconstruct spatially what that fire history might have been based on those maps. We might even be able to come in here, and if there's an old stump there, and count the fire scars and look at both the frequency and seasonality. And we think, wow, we're seeing a few more early season fires than we predicted, or we're seeing a more frequent fire than if we look at and compare to the potential lightning ignition in that area based on the fire history atlas. Well, if we talk to tribal elders, or there's ethnographic information available, and we find out that there was also a major camp there, that form of traditional ecological knowledge can help us inform or be more informed about what the frequency or the seasonality or the extent of burning perhaps the extent of those fire boundaries matched very closely to a certain cereal stage of the huckleberries, or it also was in line with the extent of the former meadow before fire exclusion or the cessation of Indian burning or stopping of Indian burning. And then ultimately, it can help us understand the effects and responses of resources to fire at different ecosystems. Often the body of literature out there on fire effects, even though the Forest Service does have the Fire Effects Information System, FEIS, it's one way of looking at how vegetative resources or plants are affected by fire. But what about animals? And so there's a growing body of literature that's out there that is new science, and perhaps we can turn to TEK and working with tribal communities to say, well, what do we expect across the scale from organism to the community to that landscape level, looking at both demographics and why certain species would be in certain places, of bringing this traditional knowledge. Also, too, would help us understand both the physical and biological processes in time. If we're thinking about, well, if we have a series of higher severity fires through here, we're going to see some more geomorphic responses. Well, what do tribal people say about how big fires affect an area? Another aspect of my research is looking at when we have large fire events, you get an inversion process that sets in that actually intercepts the solar radiation and can cool the rivers. And then during the summertime, the salmon or steelhead will migrate from the cold water tributaries to other cold water areas when the river cools as a result of that inversion. And so one of my research questions is, what's the connection between fire to fish? That was in part spurred by tribal traditional ecological knowledge about a broader kind of philosophical and holistic view of fire and its importance to fish. But now with the scientific tools, we kind of look at the mechanism and can break that down a little bit. And so that's one way we can kind of also have TEK help guide our prioritization for restoration and for our research needs. And with that, here's just a few of the different ways you can find this information, whether it's web searches or academic journals or turning into resources with the tribes. And I think we're going to get into a panel now and basically want to leave some more time for question and answer and not auctioneer fire ecology TEK 101. Well, I think if we look at diversity, just both geomorphic diversity in soil types and then the vegetation communities that are there, tribal people were keying in on some of the most biophysically diverse areas on the landscape, and then if it was appropriate, trying to further modify the composition and the structure related to the functions of those habitats with a certain frequency or seasonality or application of fire. If you understand the material cultures and tribal economies well enough, not every part of the landscape necessarily needs to be burned. If you're going for a yew-wood bow, you don't want it to have fire scars and heat checks that degrade the cross-grain nature of that wood. If you're going for medicinal plants that basically need to thrive with a rhizomatous life form and need a good duff, then you're not going to want to burn those up by having a surface and a ground fire in there. And so I think perhaps as we look at fire management units, if you're burning certain areas more frequently, it almost fireproofs the area that perhaps does better without fire. Also, if you're looking at certain cultural use species like paleated woodpeckers was an important regalia item. Woodpeckers thrive as far as their denning and nesting sites in old growth, often mature large cavity wood, but then they also need other foods like elderberry and wild grapes that often come back in a post-fire environment as another part of their life history. Or perhaps shelter, we think of shelter for other ungulates and for other wildlife. Your fur bearers, they need some burned patches, but they also need the seclusion and isolation of a non-burned area. And so if you begin to break up the landscape based on tribal land use patterns, there is a role and is a place for old growth, relatively infrequent fire areas. And I think perhaps if we think about it in the cyclical or even a century kind of scale, that if you had decades of drought, if you burned an area more frequently, you could almost perhaps create a fill barrier that when you had an east phone wind and you wanted fire to not go in that old growth, it would run through your area and go out and not be continuous and burn that whole drainage up. Although it did happen, perhaps you could modify the extent of that spatially through your traditional territory. That's my take.
And then I would add just some of the spatial complexity in the forest types as well. And we're looking a lot at the ecotone between ponderosa pine and lodgepole dominated systems, and whether it's indigenous ignitions or lightning ignitions, or plenty of both, I'm sure, over millennia. We kind of have this model in our mind where you'd have the regular burning in the ponderosa pine systems, regular frequency but low intensity and very low to no severity, and it would burn into that ecotone that lodgepole had been trying to seed into, and create some mortality there, hold the lodgepole back, and as it got to the pure lodgepole areas, that lodgepole might be at the stage where it would just go out, didn't have the fuel accumulation, and that would happen 3 years later, and it would go out, and it would happen 7 years later, and it would go out, and 2 years later, and 11 years later it would go out. But sooner or later, the clock would be caught up in terms of fuel accumulation, that it would get to the lodgepole, and the lodgepole would explode and replace itself. And that was just part of that dance over time and space that creates some of the mosaic that we see now.
Another one, Fred?
Gary Nabhan, an ethnobotanist from the Southwest, was visiting this area a while ago, and he was telling a story about being out in that country, which is wide open, and sunny and hot, and that certain ceremonial activities took place down in caves to get out of the light. And I had this flash that I have this perception that the vision questing in our landscape around here often, I would presume or guess, would occur high on the ridges, so you could get up out of the dark, damp forest. Is that a correct impression? And that also leads me to wonder about the role of fire as just a source of light and in for ceremonial purposes, or things beyond, just connecting through the forest and to material uses.
I can't speak to necessarily the tribal groups up here, but from my experience with the Northwestern California tribes, most of the power sites or vision questing areas were up on main mountaintops or ridges. And in certain cases, for a test of strength, there might be certain beings or certain kind of other forces that live in those deep, dark down areas. And if you were going to test yourself, you would then go visit those. But often those were sometimes also seen as refugia areas between where you traveled around the ridges or you dropped downhill into a spring and then came back and around. So I can't speak much more to that, though. One question I have for you is being involved with the curation in the museum. My work and a colleague of mine with Kat Anderson is basically reconstructing tribal economies and tribal management systems. And she's gone to the length of going back and looking at museum specimens to look at like plant material and look at internode spacing and saying basically the only way you get this type of form of this growth form of this plant for this particular cultural function, whether it's a certain implement or a certain instrument or whatever it might be, comes from a fire-induced change. Has there been much research that you're aware of? Are fire ecologists or people looking at historical ecologists coming to the museum to look at perhaps artifacts that might have a fire signature as part of the management, and how do you interface, or how would you have suggestions for the resources you have at the museum that could help inform fire reconstruction from a cultural material standpoint?
As far as the researchers that come in, we don't have anybody that I know of, and I'm pretty aware of the last 2.5 years of what's been researched there as far as students, tribal groups coming in. A lot of the situations that they're coming in to research about is more or less looking into how are these materials made, how are they tied, how are the knots made, and things like that. As far as the fire having any influence on these materials or these items, there hasn't been a lot of research in that. And I would highly ask Kat to send anybody down, students, anybody down to go over that. That's a really interesting subject, and I think that our doors are more than always open for new types of research, because we do find ourselves answering these same questions, going over these same answers all the time with these researchers. So by all means, please.
Isotopes to tell where they came from.
So this is the other part was that isotopes or some kind of like a little bit of sampling to also do analysis on it, if that museum allowed it. What made me think about that was I was going to try to make a flute one time and got this nice elderberry, and it had a small pith and lots of wood around it. And then I finally went to the museum and saw the elderberry flute they had was a thin wall with lots of pith that had been knocked out. And I thought, oh, that comes from the second year growth of the internode for a elderberry sprout. And so, you know, sometimes there's that kind of modification, either horticultural practice or post-fire condition, that fosters a lot of the material culture use, both implements and instruments.
One more.
Test. Well, thank you. This is amazing. And I have a question trying to link sort of our understanding of fire history to current day fire management and application. And so we have these studies that have, in certain systems, high frequency fire from tree fire scars and other ways. And but even if we let all lightning ignitions go, we may not achieve that frequency because a lot of those fires were anthropogenic and intentionally lit. So is there a way to take that understanding and bring it into our modern fire management where we recognize that systems need more fire and even letting wildfires burn may not be enough? So sort of into your sort of Forest Service management plan, bring in the knowledge that we have about human use and fire ignitions.
Yeah, good luck with that. There's still so much of the current management culture that is centered around suppression, and that I think that would be a major uphill battle. But you have some thoughts on it?
Yeah, I've worked as a resource advisor on the 2008 fires. I started off as a lead resource advisor for the Ecological and then switched over to the Siskiyou Blue. And so, from a management standpoint, you really have to work with tribal communities and work with tribes. If there's a fire within your ancestral territory, you have to develop, government-to-government agreements, then memorandum of understanding for fire use agreements, facilitate training, so you're both bringing in not only contemporary tribal knowledge, but also skills that help reconstruct and rekindle that traditional knowledge of those crews. Some of the interesting things with not only looking historically is now to use models like Farsight and to say, okay, this is the historical landscape pattern we see. If we just do the lightning ignition on there, it's not matching it. Well, then let's emulate through these simulations the tribal ignition pattern. And one of the graduate students at UC Berkeley did this. I forget his name off the top of my head, but it was done for New York Island or Manhattan. And they basically emulated what the tribal ignition would be, both in frequency and seasonality. And lo and behold, after that simulation, it matched to more of the historical General Land Office survey maps from the 1900s. And so, you can use this information. We have the models now. We just need to start thinking, wow, Indian people might have really been burning that much of the landscape, and test it. Plus going out there with them and saying, what is a culturally desired condition? And then if you're a fuel specialist and a fire behavior expert, you can pretty much almost tailor a burn plan to meet that cultural objective by incorporating all lines of evidence, both physical and biological, as well as ethnographic or cultural material. I think we can get there. We have it. We're just not utilizing or piecing things together. Last question, probably. Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Culture and Heritage Departments. I was a resource advisor on the B&B fire, and they contacted us with regards to a stand they were concerned about that were basket trees, cedar. And I visited the area, and I was pretty sure that wasn't going to ignite. It was right on the riparian. It was pretty safe. But what we were concerned about was hazard tree falls. And so we communicated with the crews, and we kind of got that area sort of flagged and protected, and did morning briefings to make sure. And it was really, a great example, like we just spoke about, of the key responsibility of resource advisors to manage the tribal communities within that fire perimeter. And it's, in the heat of the moment, sometimes that's not thought about. And you need to sometimes educate the incident management team that that's an important thing to do. And I think resource advisor training probably needs to be improved because it's not really that standardized from area to area, agency to agency.
Yeah. So basically, the main thing was the importance of resource advisors and working with tribes and heritage and natural resource protection during wildfire incidents. I'd say one other thing there is we have for wilderness areas what they call MIST, minimum impact suppression tactics. I developed a whole short list of culturally relevant MIST for other areas. These are important acorn trees. These are important meadows. These are areas we do want you to burn, but we don't want you to fall the big sugar pine snags because that's a sacred geographic marker on that little original. And so it just takes information. And I had things up on the fire information boards. I had like my little PowerPoint things I have out there. Basically breaks it down. These are all the culturally important resources that you may encounter during your contingency line and fire line construction. And this is how you can mitigate or offset any impacts of those. Well, thank you. I think we've run out of time and we should honor the next person. Thank you.